Today I would like to start with painting. So this is the starting point of today's discussion, and this is a painting of flowers in Wutaishan, more specifically near the southern peak, I believe, which is connected to Manjushri Vadisimha, and this is a painting by Mengyun Han, whom I thank. I'm very fond of this painting, and I will get back to this painting later on. I'm connecting it to today's topic somehow. And after the painting, I would like to introduce two verses. So I will recite these two verses, one of which will function as Namaskriya, and one of which will be a kind of Vastunirdesha, so a verse of homage and a verse of indication of the subject matter, although maybe in a slightly indirect manner. The first verse is very famous. Sarvadrishti prahanaya yasadharmam adeshayat anukampam upadaya tam namasyami gautamam. So I start with this verse also for a reason, which is we're talking of Madhyamaka as Abhidharma, and this verse famously says that the Buddha taught the Dharma for the sake of relinquishing all views. So is this really compatible with upholding some kind of Abhidharmic position? I imagine that in somebody's mind, this kind of objection might come up. But perhaps the next verse answers this objection indirectly. Pushpam pushpam vijinvita mulachedam nakarayet malakara ivarame nayatangarakarakaha. So this verse is a subhashita. It is found in several collections, among which Vararuchi's Gatha Shataka, and this is about plucking flowers. So this tells us how to pluck flowers. The word used is vijinvita, the verb regarding plucking flowers. So one should pluck flowers one at a time, one flower and then the next, without cutting the root. Just like someone who's making garlands in a pleasant garden, arama, not like a charcoal maker. So this verse is the topic. In what sense? In the sense that I'm arguing that Madhyamakas are garland makers rather than charcoal makers. They're rather careful about not cutting the root. There is a continuity between Madhyamaka and other preceding philosophical traditions. And Madhyamakas are very careful to maintain that continuity. So this is one reason why I picked up this verse, and the other one is the image of plucking flowers, which is central to this talk and to the one of the key points of continuity between Abhidharma and Madhyamaka. So I very briefly titled the talk Madhyamaka as Abhidharma, which sounds very counterintuitive for some, because there is a much more widespread perception that the main target of criticism of Madhyamaka indeed is Abhidharma. And even some suggest that Madhyamaka is almost like a reaction to Abhidharma. Even more specifically, perhaps, to the Sarvastivada and Vaibhashika idea of Swabhava. So this insistence on Niswabhavata maybe really is very specifically going against this trend of the Vaibhashikas, of finding this essential nature of things which is unaffected by the three times, etc., etc. So I present this talk somewhat as a corrective. Of course, there are differences in terms of ultimate view of what exists and what doesn't, and the nature of existence between Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, Yogacara, and Madhyamaka. But here I really want to show that there are also really remarkable continuities, and that Abhidharmic type of analysis does have an important place within Madhyamaka. It is not something which is simply discarded. It is used, and it is put to a slightly different purpose. I would like to give credit to those who have somewhat instilled this idea in me long ago, not exactly in the order in which it happened in my own life, but I know at least of one author, and this is Ames pointing it out in his translation of the first chapter of Bhaviveka's commentary on the Mula Madhyamaka Karika. The sub-commentator Avalokitavrata mentions that Madhyamaka is Abhidharma, but there are two types of Abhidharma, Paramarthika and Samvrata. And so here he directly states that Madhyamaka is a type of Abhidharma. So in this sense, I'm not the first one. It's not something completely new to say that Madhyamaka is a type of Abhidharma. At least there is this very significant historical precedent in Avalokitavrata. But the one who really put the idea in my own mind first is actually Walpola Rahula, and I found just one of the places which are relevant to this. This is in his translation of the Abhidharma Samuccaya, which is a translation into French, but then was translated into English by Sarah Bowen-Webb, and this is what I'm quoting here, where he says, the Mahayanists were also to elaborate and formulate their own Abhidharma. This work was carried out by two great masters, Nagarjuna and Asanga. And I believe elsewhere too, Walpola Rahula suggests that any kind of Buddhist philosophy, in some sense, is Abhidharma. And I somewhat agree with this point. So going back to flowers, this might clarify also my choices of image and poem. The definition of Abhidharma offered by Vasubandhu is that Abhidharma is Prajna. Prajnamala Sanuchara Abhidharma. And Prajna, so what we normally translate as, let's say, wisdom, is explained as Dharma Pravichaya. Let's say we could translate this as analysis of the dharmas. Now, this definition of prajna as dharma pravichaya, as wisdom as dharma pravichaya, is also found in Madhyamaka texts. And this process of analysis is common to the Abhidharma tradition and to Madhyamaka. The end result of that analysis differs, but the direction is somewhat similar. This is what I'm going to argue as being one of the very significant continuities between Abhidharma and Madhyamaka. So when Yashomitra explains this, he offers us this image of plucking flowers. So I'm showing you the text, but I will not focus on just reading word by word. I'll just point out some key points. This is the explanation of the compound dharma pravichaya. The first point is to understand the word pravichaya, which is either the agent of the action or the instrument. So it can be understood either as that which does the action of pravichinoti, which means something like plucking, collecting, or that which is used to do this action of plucking or collecting. And the example is pushpani iva. They are plucked one by one, just like flowers. Just like when we say, these are dharmas with flaxet, sasrava, these are without flaxet, ime sa anasrava. And this happens to be the very first plucking of flowers in the Abhidharma kosha itself, sasrava anasrava dharma. So that's why we have this example in Yashomitra. So you can understand this idea of collecting and also discerning. There is this idea of discerning also in Pravichaya, which we find in passages from very different types of texts. And this idea is found incidentally both in Sanskrit and in Pali. So it's a very common idea in the Buddhist tradition. Now, this applies somewhat to the two truths. So, I wish to start with Vasubandhu's definition of the two truths. Yatra bhinne natad buddhi anyapohe dhyachata ghatambuvat samvritisa paramarthasat anyatha. So, I have this idea, hypothesis, that there is an implicit image of a pot of water falling to the ground when this explanation is given. So when we have a pot of water and it falls to the ground and it breaks, we think that the pot is gone, but we still have the idea that there is water. And I think this is somewhat somewhere in at the back of this presentation of the two truths. So both a pot and water are to be considered conventionally existent rather than ultimately existent or existent in the ultimate sense. This is because they can be divided. Either they can be divided in actuality, like we are able to break a pot, or they can be divided from other conceptual elements through our mind. When by this process of removal of some other parts, we do not anymore have the idea of that entity, then we consider that entity to be only conventionally existent. If, on the other hand, we get to the point that we still have the idea of that entity, no matter how much analysis we do, then that is what is existent in an ultimate sense. So this is the basic logic. And I think even the example that is used is very significant to point to some continuities with the Madhyamaka. So just briefly, I will show you some parts of Vasubandhu's commentary on this. In the case of the pot, we actually divide it into its shards. And in the case of water, we remove other types of dharma, and then we don't get any more the idea of water. So when we remove the idea of the dharmas of visible form, etc., we don't anymore get the idea of the water that we normally see. So this is the first, actually, distinction, the first way of distinguishing. And I think this is important in one way of analysis presented in the Madhyamaka texts themselves. There's another way. There is another way of distinguishing these two. And this is the way of the Purva Acharyas. So this other way says that the way in which Lokottara Jnana or a Prishtalabdha Jnana sees things or perceive things, that is Paramartha Satya. So in other words, is how Aryas perceive things, how noble ones perceive things. That becomes Paramartha Satya. Now, this and the rest is Samriddhi Satya. So this type of subdivision, I do think also plays a role in Madhyamaka, especially when we think of Shanti Deva. In the Bodhicharyavatara, you can see that after presenting the two truths, two types of people are presented, yogi and prakritaka, and these two types of people are distinguished precisely by whether they relate to Paramartha Satya or whether they relate to Samriddhi Satya. Of course, there is a difference because then the notion of yogi Samriddhi, of the conventional truths of yogis, the way in which yogis engage with perception rather than non-perception, is also introduced. Therefore, there is not a perfect match, but I see echoes of this type of presentation of the two truths in Shantideva. So this is just a brief mention because I will not go in that direction so much more. So now let's go back to Ghata and Rupa. So if you see the example given, the first example given by Vasubandhu himself was Ghata, and Chandrakirti quotes here Aryadeva, the Chatushataka, to show that it's not only the pot that can be shown not to exist, but even visible form, rupa in the sense of visible form, can be shown not to exist or to be only metaphorically an object of perception, which here I think means same thing, it is only conventional, when we try to remove it from the Mahabhutas. So this argument, which is of Aryadeva, actually relies on the relationship between the secondary type of rupa, of materiality, and the primary type on which it is based. The primary type of materiality is the four great elements. And the secondary type of materiality is upadaya rupa, and it comprises things such as visible form, sound, etc. So visible form too depends on the, without the four great elements makes no sense. Therefore, it does not qualify as ultimately existent. This is more or less the argument here. Now, this argument is presented in the Chatushataka and followed by this example of fire and fuel. So there is actually no fire without fuel. That seems to be what is being said. Sorry for the typo, I just noticed that this should be nasty. And this is what Chandrakirti has to say about these two verses. Now, I will not go into detail about this passage because it's somewhat long, but you can see that it goes into this direction of the Mahabhutas. The things like visible form, etc., depend from the Mahabhutas. Otherwise, they do not make sense. So this is more or less the direction of the argument. And then this is related to this example of the fire and fuel, rather interestingly, and in a very ingenious way. But the reason I brought it up is to bring your attention to another text. This is the Panchaskandaka, or the Panchaskanda Prakarana of Chandrakirti. At least I agree with those who attribute it to Chandrakirti, where we find a discussion about the Bhautika and Bhuta. And the relationship between these two is exemplified through two images. One is the image of a house, griham, which is based on such things as some grass and some kashta, some pieces of wood, etc. The other example, remarkably, is the example of fire being based on fuel. So you see it's the same context and we have the same image. And here he brings the Abhidharmic analysis towards the Madhyamaka result. So this is one of the points I want to highlight. So what Chandrakirti does here is that first he says that he explains what kind of dependence there is between the secondary type of materiality and the primary type, which is the four Mahabhutas. Then he says that when the Mahabhutas in this way are shown to be without essence, nisvabhavani, so you see, here we go in a different direction. Why? Pratibimba, just like a reflected image. A reflected image is an image of contingency. We have a reflected image only when there is something else which is being reflected. So, but in the same way, the Bhautika Rupa also is Nisvabhava. So there is Nisvabhava of both sides of the equation. In the end, the whole of Rupa is shown to be without any essence. So in this way, Chandrakirti, taking some elements from Aryadeva, starts from certain features of Abhidharmic analysis and the discussion of the dependence of different elements of Rupa to show that the whole of Rupa actually is empty of Svabhava, it's empty of ultimate reality. But it is significant that the type of analysis presented is more or less of the same type. It's just that it goes one step further. And this is, I think, clear also in this very brief passage that I quote here, also from the same text. What is Prajna is Dharmanam Pravichay. Again, the same exact definition. Wisdom is the analysis of the dharmas. And now he explains it in a way which is very close to what Vasubandhu mentions in the context of the two truths. So here we can see a kind of relationship between the process of analysis and the way in which we establish the two truths. These parts which I put in italics are additions by Abhayavara Gupta, if I understand Lian Kano's edition correctly. So Bodhya through the mind, avayavashaha, into pieces, vibhanjana, vibhanjaya, swarupam veshana. So it's a type of looking for the nature of something by breaking through the mind into parts. So you can see this word avayavashaha, which is again something used by Vasubandhu as well. And so this is somewhat something in common between the process as it appears in the Abhidharma and the process as it appears in Madhyamaka. Now, the difference is the result. So I will skip this word, Nisvabhavataya, because this is Abhayakara Gupta's edition, but just if we read this sentence, we can see what the result is in Madhyamaka, and that is literal. Pudgalasya dharmanam cha swarupam parichyamanam na kinchit upalavate. So when the nature of the person and of the dharmas is observed, is analyzed, one does not perceive anything. So here you can see how we go towards what some Madhyamaka texts call the Anupalamba Yoga, the yoga of non-perception. But the process is the same, it's just we go one step further. So this is one area where I think the continuity is very clear. Now, the other area of continuity that I would like to point to is the causal primacy of mind, and therefore the role of karma. So this is an important theme in Madhyamaka texts. Yes, mind is not regarded as being ultimately existent, but indeed the fact that mind is pradhana, is the main causal factor, is the most relevant causal factor, is actually the reason why the Buddha spoke of Chittamatra according to Chandrakirti. So we can see that there is this connection between the words pradhana and the word kartra, and this connection comes from grammar. So from the sutra where Panini defines the karta as the one who is swatantraha, and then this is described as being pradhana, the main one, the kind of a guiding causal force. And this idea is very much present throughout Madhyamaka. Now I just want to show it briefly in a couple of places within Prajñākaramati, who is commenting on the Bodhicharyavatara, where it is said that all the types of dangers and all the types of unlimited types of suffering all come from the mind. This has been said by the one who speaks things as they are. And the reason is karma. Karma akshepa vasha. So karma is just mind. Why? Because karma is cetana, karma is intention. And that is not without the mind. So this is the connection. Karma is actually the connection between the idea of the causal primacy of the mind and how it can even affect the entirety of the universe. And in that context, Prajñākaramati actually quotes Vasubandhu, Karmajan loka vaichityam cetana tat kritam chata. So the variety of the world is born from karma, and that is an intention of what is done due to an intention. So in this way, we have the three types of karma of mind, speech, and body. Now, the other part which I want to show is that once again, Prajñākaramati quotes this very verse and he juxtaposes it with a verse by Chandrakirti. So first he quotes the verse that we read before, Karmajam loka vechityam cetana tat kritam chata. So The variety of the world is generated by karma, etc., etc. And then there's a verse by Chandrakirti, which is actually probably inspired also by that verse of Vasubandhu. Sattva lokam atabhajana lokam chittameva rachayat yati chitram karmajam hi jagaduttama karma chittam avaduya jana nachasti. So the world of sentient beings, so the inner world of the mind streams, atha bhajana lokam, and the world which is the receptacle, the environment of sentient beings, Chittameva rachayati ati chittam. It is the mind itself which arranges it, and it makes it ati chittam, extremely variegated. So you can see ati chittam kind of echo of loka vaicitya. This is, I think, clearly a parallel. Karmajam hi jagat uktamasheshan. It has been said that the entirety of the world is karmajam. Again, you see the same word, karmajam, is generated or born from karma. Karma chittam avadhuya nachasti. And there is no karma apart from the mind. So you can see this point, the causal primacy of the mind. This is very important in Madhyamaka. I've pointed it out elsewhere. There are other contexts where this comes up, of course, but the idea of karma is a key point. That's why I find that the chapter on the Dwadashanga actually is so important in the Mula Madhyamaka, and is so much connected also with the idea of removing all the views. There is a certain progression in the Mula Madhyamaka, and now I cannot go into it too much in detail, but I want to say a few things. Many people have thought of what is the rationale behind the arrangement of the Mula Madhyamaka. And my own impression so far is that the Mula Madhyamaka is related to two types of texts. One is certain sutras, and I pointed out that the progression that we find of analyzing a certain type of wrong view, then presenting dependent arising, and then the relinquishing of all views is actually a recurrent feature in a number of Shravaka Sutra, or non-Mahayana sutras, as well as in some Mahayana sutras. Furthermore, and for this I would need some sinologist help, but I believe that this is also connected to the arrangement of certain early Abhidharma treatises, such as the Dharmaskandha and the Vibhanga. And for these, yes, I have some limitations, severe limitations, since I do not read Chinese. But my impression, reading about the arrangement, is that the Mula Madhyamaka was also reflecting the arrangement of those texts. And this is something which I think would be a worthwhile area of investigation. So, okay, sorry, I think I have spoken too much. So let me try to wrap it up by going back to the initial image. So the image that I showed in the beginning was actually, let's say, inspired by this, which is a photo. And I think there's distinction between these two images, meaning the painting and the photo, to some extent capture my understanding of how differently, but also how similarly, the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika and the Madhyamaka use Abhidharmic type of analysis, which means that when we look at the shapes which make up for this image, we are immediately led to believe that it corresponds to something outside of a picture which has been photographed. This is not necessarily the case when we look at a painting. Even though we are still using certain types of shapes, etc., we could use those very same types of shapes to speak rather of unreality, rather than trying to look for an outer reference. So although these analogy is not 100% precise, I thought it could give some kind of idea of how I understand the difference, but also the similarities. So I hope that I've been able to highlight certain continuities between Madhyamaka and the Abhidharma tradition, and also the sense in which we can say that Madhyamaka is a type of Abhidharma in the sense of being a type of prajna and also a type of process of dharma pravijaya. This was perhaps the main point here. So I think that I'm slightly beyond my allotted time. So now I think that I would like to offer you the opportunity to ask some questions. If anyone has any questions or comments or something you would like to discuss, but I will have to, you may have to either unmute yourselves or you can write it on the chat.